What if the echoes of past generations, specifically childhood trauma, are unconsciously shaping your present? This video uncovers the invisible threads of inherited psychological patterns that silently ripple through families, impacting everything from your self-worth to your ability to connect. There's a certain kind of childhood story that rarely gets told, not because it isn't painful, but because it unfolds quietly, without drama, without noise, without the kinds of wounds people know how to recognize. A little girl sits at the edge of the living room, holding a drawing she worked on all week. She waits for a moment of eye contact, a smile, a simple "I see it." But her parents move around her as if she isn't there. After a few minutes, she lowers the drawing, folds it in half, and slips it under her bed. Years later, she can't explain why she feels ashamed when someone compliments her work. She just knows praise makes her uncomfortable, as if visibility itself is dangerous. This is the quiet beginning of an internal wound, one built not from harsh words or raised voices, but from emotional absence, the kind that teaches a child their feelings are inconvenient, their needs too heavy, their presence too easily overlooked. Childhood trauma is often misunderstood as only physical harm or explicit abuse, yet some of the deepest scars come from what never happened. The missing acknowledgement, the lack of emotional attunement, the moments when a child's excitement was ignored or their sadness dismissed. Emotional neglect creates invisible trauma patterns that shape identity long before a child has the language to describe what's happening to them. They learn to shrink themselves to avoid disappointment. They silence their needs before anyone else can silence them. They internalize the belief that asking for comfort is burdensome and that their inner world is something best hidden away. This form of trauma is subtle, quiet, and often unrecognized, even by the person living with its effects. What makes this silence so devastating is its ability to become a lifelong script. A neglected child grows up believing feelings should be suppressed, discomfort swallowed, vulnerability avoided. They learn self-abandonment before they even understand the concept. They carry emotional deprivation into adulthood as chronic loneliness, internalized shame, and an instinctive fear of being truly seen. They turn their childhood survival strategies into personality traits. The people pleaser who tries to earn love through perfection, the avoidant adult who withdraws at the first sign of emotional closeness, the emotionally numb individual who can't explain why they feel empty, even in safe environments. These behaviors aren't flaws. They are echoes of a childhood where needs were ignored and emotions were treated as disruptions. The central question that emerges is both simple and profoundly unsettling. How does childhood emotional neglect follow someone into adulthood, shaping their self-worth, their relationships, and even their parenting? Developmental psychology now confirms what many adults sense but cannot articulate. Attachment wounds, ignored feelings, and internalized shame do not fade with time. They become the unconscious blueprint for how a person navigates the world. A child who learned to stay quiet becomes an adult who fears expressing emotions. A child who felt invisible becomes an adult who assumes they do not matter. And an adult carrying unresolved wounds may unintentionally pass those patterns to their own children, not through intention, but through the emotional scripts they inherited. This ripple effect is what makes emotional neglect an intergenerational trauma, even when no one recognizes it as such. The neglected child becomes hyper-aware of others, scanning for rejection, anticipating disappointment, monitoring the emotional climate the way they once monitored their parents. They develop avoidance coping, emotional suppression, and silence as a default response. Their self-doubt becomes instinct, their low self-worth a quiet companion, their fear of vulnerability a barrier that shapes every connection. What began as emotional absence becomes a lifelong narrative about who they are allowed to be. This section lays the emotional and psychological foundation for understanding that trauma is not always loud. Sometimes it is inherited through silence, carried through unseen wounds, and kept alive by the patterns someone learned just to survive. Intergenerational trauma often begins long before a child is born, quietly woven into the emotional history of the family. A parent who grew up never having their feelings acknowledged may raise a child with the same emotional limitations, not out of neglectful intent, but because silence became their own survival language. When a mother who was taught to suppress As sadness sees her child cry, she may instinctively say, "You're fine," without realizing she is passing on the same emotional dismissal that shaped her. When a father carries unresolved fear or attachment anxiety from his childhood, his tone, reactions, and emotional distance become the atmosphere his children learn to breathe. These patterns are not loud, not violent, not obvious, but they become the invisible hand guiding how trauma moves from one generation to the next. Epigenetics helps explain this in simple terms. Chronic stress, emotional neglect, and ongoing feelings of fear or invalidation can cause certain genes to switch on or off, changing how the body responds to emotional stimuli. It doesn't rewrite DNA, but it changes how genes express themselves, altering stress responses, emotional regulation, and even the way the nervous system reacts to connection or threat. A parent who grew up in an environment of emotional absence may carry stress markers that make them more reactive, more shut down, or more avoidant. Their child, exposed to this emotional climate, develops similar patterns not only through modeling, but through inherited sensitivity. Trauma becomes a biological whisper passed forward, shaping how the next generation perceives closeness, danger, or vulnerability. Children learn most deeply not from what parents say, but from what parents feel and how they behave. When a caregiver lives in emotional shutdown, rarely expressing tenderness or admitting fear, their child absorbs the message that emotions are unsafe or unwelcome. If a parent minimizes pain, "Stop crying, it's nothing," the child internalizes the belief that their feelings are too much. If a caregiver avoids vulnerability, avoids difficult conversations, or withdraws when stressed, the child learns to silence themselves in the same way. These lessons become inherited emotional scripts. Don't ask for help, don't show weakness, don't expect support, don't trust closeness. The parent may believe they are protecting the child from discomfort, but what they are really passing on is the blueprint for emotional distance. Many emotionally neglected children adopt survival strategies that mirror their parents' unhealed wounds. When a parent copes through hyperindependence, the child becomes the strong one who never asks for anything. When a parent suppresses their emotions, the child learns emotional repression as a default setting. When a parent constantly overfunctions, working endlessly, avoiding rest, caretaking everyone but themselves, the child may grow into an adult who believes rest equals guilt and self-care equals selfishness. Even silence becomes a learned pattern. A child watches a parent swallow their feelings, avoid eye contact, or retreat into another room, and they learn self-silencing without ever being told to be quiet. These inherited scripts shape identity in powerful ways. A child who grows up watching emotional minimization may grow into an adult who downplays their own pain. A child who sees fear of closeness may develop avoidant attachment, believing intimacy is unsafe. A child who observes a parent shrinking themselves to avoid conflict may internalize the belief that taking up space is dangerous. These are not dramatic traumas. They are quiet, consistent patterns passed down like family heirlooms. They shape how a person learns to love, to trust, to ask, to feel, and even to breathe. Intergenerational trauma is often misunderstood as something born from catastrophic events, but in many homes it is carried through tone, silence, emotional absence, and the subtle ways caregivers respond to stress. It can be found in the quiet tension in a room, the way a parent avoids eye contact when emotions rise, the way a child learns to soothe themselves because no one else will. It lives in the inherited fears, the learned emotional suppression, the generational avoidance of vulnerability, and the patterns of attachment that repeat until someone becomes conscious enough to break them. In many families, emotional neglect is not taught through words, but through atmosphere. A parent who grew up afraid of their own emotions often creates a home where feelings are quietly pushed aside, where discomfort is hidden behind forced calm, and where emotional expression feels unsafe without anyone explicitly saying so. The child learns to read the air, not because they are told to, but because nonverbal cues, tight shoulders, averted eyes, silence after vulnerability, communicate more than words ever could. This is the unconscious inheritance at the core of dark psychology, trauma passed down through tone, energy, and emotional absence, shaping a child long before they can name what they are feeling. The parent's unresolved wounds become the child's emotional landscape. Projective identification deepens this invisible transmission. A parent carrying unresolved shame may unconsciously treat their child as if the child is too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, projecting their own wounds outward. A parent who feels emotionally numb may expect the child to be the strong one, shaping them into the quiet observer or the problem solver long before they understand why. A parent terrified of vulnerability may respond to their child's emotions with discomfort, shaping the child into the people pleaser who learns to soothe others at the expense of themselves. And a parent living in a constant state of emotional shutdown may unintentionally push the child into perfectionistic coping, striving to earn love through achievement because emotional attunement never felt available. In this way, the parent's unspoken fears, their avoidance, and their suppressed emotions become embedded in the child's identity. These patterns repeat across generations like a psychological echo. Emotional repression becomes a family norm. Don't cry, don't talk about feelings, don't ask for too much. Trauma response behaviors become inherited traits: hypervigilance, emotional withdrawal, silence as protection, or over-explaining to avoid conflict. Abandonment wounds appear without a single dramatic event. They grow from years of feeling unseen. Children learn that withdrawing keeps them safe, that masking keeps the peace, that emotional survival mode is better than risking real connection. They become experts in emotional scanning, reading micro-expressions and tone changes because they needed to anticipate rejection early in life. These repetitive cycles make the child feel responsible for maintaining harmony, a burden no child should carry, but many silently do. As the child grows, internalized parental voices begin to shape their inner world. The parent who dismissed their feelings becomes the inner critic saying, "You're overreacting." The parent who avoided closeness becomes the internal warning that says, "Don't get too attached." The parent who ignored emotional bids becomes the voice whispering, "Your needs are too much." These internalized scripts create emotional blind spots, places where the child-turned adult cannot see their worth, cannot recognize their needs, cannot understand why they feel empty even in stable relationships. What they unconsciously absorbed becomes the blueprint through which they view themselves. This is how the invisible child becomes the emotionally invisible adult. Their identity wounds follow them quietly. Trust issues that make closeness feel threatening, fear of being seen that turns vulnerability into a risk, chronic loneliness that persists even in the company of others, emotional emptiness that feels impossible to fill, and a lifelong habit of seeking external validation because internal validation was never modeled. They may appear independent, yet their hypervigilance reveals a nervous system always scanning for emotional danger. They may seem calm, yet behind the mask lies emotional shutdown that protected them as a child, but now isolates them as an adult. The dark psychology behind inherited neglect is not about dramatic cruelty. It is about emotional absence repeated until it becomes a defining pattern. A parent's silence becomes a child's self-doubt. A parent's emotional numbness becomes the child's identity confusion. A parent's avoidance becomes the child's fear of intimacy. These unconscious transmissions shape survival strategies that were necessary once, but become self-sabotaging later. Shrinking oneself to stay safe, abandoning personal needs, suppressing emotions until numbness feels normal, relying on toxic independence because depending on anyone feels dangerous. In this inheritance, the child learns not who they are but who they must be to survive in a world where emotional presence was never consistent. And unless those patterns are brought to light, the cycle continues, from one generation of unseen children to the next. Healing from emotional neglect does not begin with perfection. It begins with recognition. For many adults who grew up unseen, unheard, or emotionally dismissed, the first step is simply acknowledging that what happened to them left real wounds. The numbness, the emotional shutdown, the difficulty naming feelings, these are not personal failures, but natural responses to years spent in emotional survival mode. Healing means slowly reconnecting with emotions that were once unsafe, rebuilding an identity that was shaped by silence, and learning to inhabit a self that was never fully allowed to exist. This transition toward hope requires courage, patience, and a willingness to sit with feelings that were suppressed for decades. Therapeutic modalities provide structured pathways for this work. EMDR helps process traumatic memories that were stored unprocessed in the nervous system, reducing the emotional charge behind old wounds. Somatic experiencing focuses on the body, recognizing that trauma is not only a psychological imprint but also a physical one, held in tension, shallow breathing, hypervigilance. Lance or chronic shutdown. By slowly releasing these stored sensations, the body relearns safety. Inner child work offers a bridge between past and present, inviting adults to meet the younger versions of themselves with compassion rather than criticism. Family systems therapy helps identify inherited emotional scripts and patterns, making it possible to break cycles that once felt inevitable. Each of these modalities supports the journey from emotional numbness to emotional presence. A lifetime of emotional illiteracy can make naming feelings seem impossible, but developing emotional awareness is central to healing. Many adults who were ignored or dismissed as children learn to minimize pain, downplay emotions, or silence their needs. Now, the work is to sit with feelings instead of avoiding them, to name what arises instead of pushing it away. Simple practices like journaling, mindfulness, or noticing physical cues can help reconnect with suppressed emotions. Saying, "I feel sad," or "I feel overwhelmed" might seem small, but for someone who grew up emotionally neglected, these moments are acts of reclamation, steps toward recovering an inner voice that was taught to stay quiet. Self-compassion becomes another essential tool. Adults who endured emotional deprivation often carry harsh internal critics, inherited from the dismissive voices of their past. Learning to validate their own experiences, telling themselves "my feelings matter" or "it makes sense that I feel this way," begins to soften those internalized wounds. Rebuilding identity means letting go of the roles they adopted to stay safe: the people pleaser, the perfectionist, the hyper-independent caretaker. As they grow more emotionally present and more comfortable with vulnerability, they gradually replace survival patterns with healthier responses. Healing rarely happens in isolation. Safe relationships become a powerful corrective experience. A friend who listens without judgment, a therapist who mirrors emotional truth, a partner who responds with consistency. These relationships provide the emotional presence that was missing in childhood. Through these connections, the nervous system begins to trust again. When someone responds with care instead of dismissal, the old belief, "my needs are a burden," starts to loosen. When someone stays instead of withdrawing, the fear of abandonment softens. Slowly, the emotional blind spots created by neglect begin to clear. Reparenting yourself is another crucial step. It means offering yourself the emotional care you were denied, comforting yourself when you feel overwhelmed, celebrating your accomplishments, validating your pain, setting boundaries that protect your well-being. It means ending emotional invisibility by allowing yourself to exist fully, no longer shrinking to avoid upsetting others. Asking for help becomes an act of healing, not weakness. Setting boundaries becomes a declaration of self-worth, not selfishness. As these practices accumulate, the nervous system begins to rewire through neuroplasticity. The body learns that it is safe to feel, safe to speak, safe to connect. Old survival patterns, silence, emotional withdrawal, toxic independence, slowly lose their grip. In their place emerges emotional regulation, deeper self-understanding, and a growing sense of emotional safety. Loneliness starts to lift as the person reconnects not only with others but with themselves. This is how healing loneliness begins. By breaking the survival patterns that once kept connection at a distance, by reclaiming emotional presence, and by allowing vulnerability to become a bridge rather than a threat. Healing intergenerational trauma is not about erasing the past, but about choosing a different future. One where emotional visibility replaces silence, where self-compassion replaces self-abandonment, and where a fully lived inner world replaces the emptiness once inherited. Resilience does not erase the past, but it transforms the way the past lives inside you. Many adults who grew up emotionally neglected believe their story is already written, that the quiet child they once were has permanently shaped the adult they have become. But the truth is far more hopeful. Childhood emotional neglect may leave deep emotional wounds, identity confusion, and years of loneliness, yet it does not define a person forever. Human beings are wired for healing, capable of rebuilding identity, reclaiming self-worth, and ending emotional invisibility in ways that generations before them never imagined possible. There are countless real-world examples of individuals who broke the cycle of generational neglect, not through perfection, but through courage. Some found healing in therapy, learning to name emotions after decades of emotional numbness. Others discovered connection through friendships or partners who offered the emotional presence they never received as children. Some rebuilt their inner world through journaling, meditation, or inner child work, slowly replacing self-abandonment with self-compassion. These stories remind us that resilience is not a grand transformation. It is a series of small, honest moments where a person chooses connection over silence, vulnerability over avoidance, and authenticity over emotional masking. People who heal from emotional neglect often become some of the most empathetic adults. Their pain becomes the soil where empathy grows. Because they know what it feels like to be unseen, they develop a profound ability to see others. This empathy born from pain becomes one of their greatest strengths. Instead of letting their past define them, they use it as a guide toward deeper awareness, emotional honesty, and compassion. Reclaiming self-worth becomes an act of resistance against the old narratives that once told them they were too much or not enough. Every time they validate their own feelings, every time they set a boundary, every time they choose emotional presence, they rewrite the emotional script they inherited. Rebuilding identity after emotional neglect is a gradual process. It often starts with acknowledging the inner wounds instead of hiding from them. For many, this means learning to trust their emotions again, allowing themselves to feel without shame, and understanding that their needs are not burdens, they are human. As they take these steps, something powerful begins to happen. The inner world that once felt empty begins to feel alive. Emotional authenticity becomes safer. The nervous system slowly rewires itself toward connection, and the cycle of hypervigilance, self-silencing, and survival strategies begins to loosen. Ending emotional invisibility requires intentional effort, but it is entirely possible. Adults who learn to shrink themselves as children can learn to take up space again, not arrogantly, but truthfully. They can learn to speak up, ask for support, and allow others to see the parts of them that were once hidden. Through this process, they claim the right to exist fully. They become adults capable of building secure relationships, creating emotional safety for themselves and others, and offering future generations what they never received: attunement, presence, and unconditional validation. Resilience does not mean the pain disappears. It means the pain no longer dictates the future. It means choosing healing even when fear whispers old stories. It means recognizing that breaking generational patterns is not a single moment, but a lifelong journey, one filled with setbacks, breakthroughs, and profound self-discovery. This healing journey becomes a legacy of hope, proving that the cycle can indeed end here. What makes this transformation even more meaningful is its impact on future generations. When one person acknowledges their wounds, practices emotional honesty, and learns to connect authentically, they free their children and their children's children from inheriting the same emotional burden. Healing becomes a form of generational protection. The invisible child becomes the adult who refuses to let their family's story end in silence. And so this section closes on a truth that lifts the entire narrative. Acknowledging the wound is the first step toward freedom. The moment someone says, "This happened to me, and it mattered," they step out of the shadow of emotional invisibility and into the beginning of a new lineage, one defined not by silence, but by resilience, connection, and hope.